This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hi everybody, welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale, I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Paul Fischer, who is the author of a new book called The Man Who Invented Motion Pictures, A True Tale of Obsession, Murder and the Movies. It's a great book, a history of the very earliest days of the motion picture industry and the men and women who had a hand in inventing them. So it's a really interesting story and one that I can pretty much guarantee you will add to your knowledge. There's some revelations in there that I found really surprising, really interesting. So I'm going to be talking to him, and it's going to be great. So if you like the episode, please remember to like, subscribe, and do all that other stuff that I ask you to do. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. DrJonty. Over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be attending some film festivals right into September. Actually, I'm going to be at Locarno, and then I'm going to Sarajevo, and then I'm going to Venice. So the episodes should still keep coming, but I'll also try to put up some interviews with film critics and people that I meet along the way to talk about film books and what they're interested in as well. Anyway, before any of that happens though, enjoy the conversation.
I don't know, right? It's an interesting thing because I grew up in France, where it's kind of just assumed the Lumiere brothers invented the movies. That's just how it is. Case closed. And I remember being a kid, and occasionally someone would come up going, "Hey, machin, someone made a camera before them," and you'd always look into it and go, "Well, that thing didn't work. That doesn't count." And so you'd kind of dispute it. And then I went to film school in the US. And it seemed like the people there, it was also an open and shut case, that it was Thomas Edison. And there's just no kind of question about it. The whole projection thing, just a French thing, it doesn't matter. And I guess the thing about Le Prince, I found out about him, looked into it. I was, I guess in the first place, amazed by this thing of, I assumed he'd be one of those people like the other guys, where I came across Louis Le Prince. There's this novel by Theodore Rorschach called Flicker, which is kind of like a Da Vinci Code, but about the movies. And there's this idea in the conspiracy thriller novel that the movies are kind of a mind control Illuminati thing. But he does that thing where he mixes in real life stuff with made up stuff. And there's a bit in the book where he brings up this guy, Louis Le Prince, who made the first film, and he disappeared. And it was years before the Lumiere brothers or Thomas Edison. And I remember being on this holiday, reading this book, getting to that bit and going, "Oh, is that one of the real bits or one of the made up bits? That sounds like a real bit." And so I looked it up, and the thing that was interesting about Le Prince was, like, he had existed, he had disappeared, he had made these films that existed still, at least in part, and the cameras were still there, and the projector was still there, and the patents were there, and they had been granted, and it seemed very, very legit. But I'd never heard of him, and I was kind of obsessive about the whole period from inventing the movies, like Georges Méliès and all these people who had kind of like tragic endings. I kind of like people who come really close to something and it kind of slips through their fingers. And somehow I'd never heard of him. And so it feels to me, from my perspective, that it's never really been seriously disputed, because the people that are brought up aren't kind of serious contenders, but Le Prince was, and somehow, for a confluence of reasons, he kind of slipped through the cracks. And the thing that was interesting about him slipping through the cracks in me too is, in both cases of the Lumiere brothers and Thomas Edison, we kind of framed the invention of movies as a technological thing, as an advancement of technology rather than an artistic thing. And Le Prince was someone who was more in the lineage of people doing something creative than he was an engineer or an industrialist or someone like that. And so it was cool to think of this idea of like, oh, the first film ever made wasn't some kind of technological breakthrough per se necessarily. It was like a home movie.
Mm.
You know, as a guy filming his family in a backyard, walking around in circles, because he had this idea for an extension of photography creatively. But yeah, I don't have a sense that, you know, I didn't grow up thinking it's a dispute who invented the movies. I've never met people who are like, you know, well, that's not the case, and that's kind of stood up. But like, there's really no way you can argue Le Prince didn't make the oldest film we have, and
Right.
somehow no one knows him.
Yeah, right. His name has no sort of recognition value the way the Lumiere brothers do, the Edison does. You
Yeah,
know, we have cinemas which are named, you know, the Edison in my town, and the Lumiere is a theatre in Cannes that I go to. So,
yeah, yeah. And it's his thing as well, which I think writing the book was interesting, is the reason he's forgotten kind of plays on how we write film history and how it is influenced by these kind of nationalistic images of what this technology represents about a certain culture and its kind of cultural ownership of the 20th century. And Le Prince, in a very modern way, was kind of homeless. You know, he was kind of a Frenchman who'd been born in a part of France that had been Germany for a while, and he lived in England, but he also went to America and he wanted to get American citizenship. And so, in a way, there were two things to why he was forgotten that were fascinating to me. One was that bit, that there was no one to kind of claim him as a kind of national pride thing. And then he never sold a ticket. There's kind of this built-in assumption that you've invented a thing if you sold a ticket to it, or if you've sold it to someone. That's meant to be what makes it work. And if you've made a movie but you haven't sold a ticket, then have you really made a movie? And that's a weirdly kind of modern capitalistic Hollywoody idea, but it's baked in right there in how we think of who got there first.
yeah, it's almost like nowadays, do you really have a blog or a podcast if you're not monetizing it? You know, I mean,
Yeah,
you know, it's that same idea, really.
yeah, which is kind of stuff we do. Like I was never able to say I wrote until somebody bought something I wrote.
Yeah.
You know, otherwise you just get kind of weird about it. And he was that guy where you're like, well, the camera's there, the projector's there, the film's there, but did someone pay to see it?
I think it's interesting as well the point that you make about the geography, because he's also working in Leeds, isn't he?
Yeah,
Which is not Manchester, it's not London, it's not like a real. I mean, it's a relatively large industrial city in the north of England, but it's away from the centre of power in a way.
yeah, and it's weird how we've narrowed down the places that matter even more since then. Because back then Leeds was a big deal, and there were a bunch of cities that were a big deal. But now it's kind of London, New York, Tokyo, Paris, or bust, really kind of thing. Because he was a guy who'd moved from Paris to Leeds and was like, this place is a big deal, and I fit in here. And you know, because Le Prince, for people who haven't read the book, you know, he's kind of a bourgeois French young guy at the beginning of the book who has no, I guess, clear ambition or purpose of what he wants to do. And he goes to Leeds and he meets all these engineers and industrialists who are involved in the Industrial Revolution. And it's this idea that you can come up with something and then get a patent to it and claim it that's driving the world. And that's happening in Leeds and Manchester and Bradford and all these places, and not necessarily London. And even in New York was Edison, really. It was like kind of like the one-man town for that kind of stuff. But, you know, like I've lived in England 12, 13 years, and I remember moving and kind of assimilating that weird thing where like there's London and then there's all the other places.
Yeah, London's almost like a different part of the country. I've like students
Yeah,
from Italy who say, "Oh, I've been to London." And it's kind of like, you probably you haven't quite been to England then. You know, I mean, you've been to the London version of England, which is great, but it's. I mean, the majority of people who live in London weren't born there. The majority of people who live in London won't die there. It's that kind of town, you know.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Which I remember, you know, as a foreigner, the whole Brexit thing, it really underlined that thing of like, oh yeah, this is a different place from the rest of the country, which I guess all capitals and kind of the rest of the countries in the West are becoming that way. But Leeds at the time, like, was a big deal. And it was, I think to your point, there's also no sexiness to that. Do you know what I mean? Like we want to be like Thomas said, New York is the birthplace of the movies. Hollywood is a place where it all happens. There's almost an assumption. Like I remember reading the book and going, well, it can't be Leeds. Why would it be Leeds?
Yeah, but it's interesting that you correct me on that point. Actually, that I was kind of doing that. I was doing the modern thing of going, "Oof, he was at Leeds. No wonder nobody noticed him." And
Yeah.
and yet you're saying, no. In the 19th century, that was a hotbed of innovation.
Yeah, it really was. Like all those cities in that area, but that's also, another part of how we think about history, I suppose, in a way, is it's become like we assimilate all these things about what sounds right that doesn't sound right. And like I had a thing coming to this where like I never have this idea, the kind of ego to go, I'm writing something no one has ever written about before. Like it's all been done. And it's, I guess the positive flip side of that is this idea that we don't think of nonfiction authors as having a voice or kind of a point of view, but we do, and that kind of makes the book too. But we assimilate these ideas, and it also colors how we tell these stories. Like there's been documentaries about Le Prince and stories about Le Prince that are so attached to the idea of restoring Leeds almost as much as restoring him. And in a weird way that undercuts your argument because you're sort of shooting off the side of goal, as it were. But you're combating this other assumption rather than the point itself, which, if I was from Leeds or something and everyone else's assumption was nothing important could have fucking happened there. And you're like, well, the reason you've got the trains and the things and all this stuff in the 9th century is us. And now we're considered kind of irrelevant. Yeah, you would want to kind of speak up about that.
Yeah, I can track your 13 years in England by your sporting metaphors as well. You're shooting wider goals. Just for our listeners who may not yet have read the book, they will soon. I'm absolutely sure. But Le Prince is operating from, well, he's born around about the mid 19th century. Is that right?
Yeah, 1841.
Right, so around about 1841, perfect. And then in France, he's not like he's born in a sort of town which is connected to Paris, but not particularly close, right?
That's right. Yeah, he was born in Metz, which is right on the eastern border between France and what was then Prussia, Germany.
Right.
And that was territory, the whole of Alsace-Lorraine, which was, in the 100 or so years before that. It really felt like it was German one minute and French the next, and it was very disputed, that kind of whole entry into the Rhine Valley thing. And so Louis Le Prince was born in Metz in 1841, and he's kind of born into this world that's still horse carts and no one leaving their hometown and letters and, kind of still pre-industrial revolution. And he grows up in this time of amazing change. It's kind of comparable to now, I suppose, if I think of my grandmother to like TikTok, where, by the time he's in his 30s, people are traveling across the Atlantic, and you've got the telegraph, and you've got steam trains, and you've got news being reported from around the world, and the world's kind of exploding. And he's a guy who's kind of interested in art, and he paints and he takes photographs, and he allegedly has met Louis Daguerre, one of the inventors of photography, when he was a kid, but also has a kind of scientific bent. And he goes to university to study optics and chemistry, and he kind of develops all these skills, doesn't really know what to do with them, meets a woman from Yorkshire called Elizabeth Whitley, falls in love, goes back to Leeds, marries her, starts working for the family firm, which is one of those kind of iron forge factory businesses where they make, boiler knobs and a bunch of other stuff I don't understand. And while he's there, he starts kind of trying to combine his artistic photographic endeavors with trying to invent new processes. And one of the things he comes up with is this idea, kind of almost by accident, that if you could make photographs move, then you could basically recreate life. And the hook about Le Prince is, Thomas Edison comes out with his kind of motion picture thing in 1891, and the Lumiere brothers have their first screening in 1895. Le Prince shot his what we think of the first film, the oldest surviving film, in 1888, and it can be dated because one of the people in the film dies in 1888. So it can be shot after that. So he makes it 3 years before Edison comes out with his, a whole 7 years before the Lumiere brothers. But before he can make it public, before he can hold a screening, he gets on a train in France, disappears, is never seen or heard from ever again. And literally months after that happens, Thomas Edison announces he's working on a thing that sounds awfully like what Le Prince had a patent for. And no one knows what's happened to him, or has known until now. And that's kind of the hook. And the Le Prince camera, I guess his final camera, which has one lens, is a film camera. Like one of those documentaries I was talking about, they built an exact replica of the camera and ran modern film through it, and they were like, "This works. It's a camera. And it's the first recognizable, like where you would look at it and go, well, that's a film camera, not like a zoetrope or a zoopraxiscope or a magic lantern. That's a camera, and that exists, and it's still in Bradford, and the films exist, and they've been restored. But because of this disappearance, he kind of gets written out of history, because one of the things about, which I don't know if it's still the case today, but at least back then, if someone disappeared and you found no body, then their property, including their intellectual property, was frozen for 7 years, or until you found a body, and then it could be declared dead. So for 7 years after he disappears, his family can't fight for his claim. They can't, take Thomas Edison to court. They can't start building the machines. They're just stuck in this limbo. And that 7 years is enough for him to get completely erased. Because there's that thing too, where if after that 7 years, if you come out when the movie is already everywhere and a huge deal, and people are making, whatever the equivalent back then of millions of dollars are, and you come out and you go, "Oh, my dad did this before anybody else, but it was like 7 years ago, and like he disappeared," like you just sound like a lunatic. You sound like a fabulous. And so that's kind of what happened to his family, and his disappearance had kind of tragic consequences for everybody around him. And so for anybody who hasn't read it, the book kind of unpacks how he got to inventing the movies, and then the kind of what happens after that.
Yeah. We don't want to spoil. We don't spoil too much, but it's that hook that you talk about that's the bit when I'm reading it that I'm thinking, this is a movie. This story is a movie.
It is, and it's because it's also his family, his widow, wife especially, became convinced Thomas Edison must have had a hand in him disappearing and killing him. And so because he was never found, because it's one of those unsolved Victorian mysteries, that's kind of the thing that stuck to anybody who knows Louis Le Prince is he might have been killed by Edison. Like I still will get Louis Le Prince pings on Twitter today where people are like, well, Thomas Edison had him killed, and it's you should look it up. And it kind of marries that thing we have now, where it's the fashionable thing now is Thomas Edison was a horrible, crooked, evil person.
Yeah, there's a sort of Tesla. Tesla was amazing. These alternative figures were amazing and magical, and they had all this thing. And this guy who sort of won the present, if you like, weirdly has lost the future, has lost the sort of reputational battle.
Yeah, and it's a really hard one to fight. Like when I was writing the book, the way I think of Edison is I think of him as kind of Steve Jobs, or right. A Musk type figure, or I guess closer to Jobs in the sense that, like, if you read Edison's notes and papers and explanations of the film camera, he had no clue how it works, none whatsoever. There was a guy called William Dixon who worked for him, who worked on it and invented it, and Edison kind of ran this department where he would initiate stuff that sounded like a good idea and then often help finish it. But it was a very modern kind of like, this is a company where we have a bunch of engineers and guys who work on stuff. I can't keep abreast of everything. And, he busted unions, and he was dishonest, and he was self-aggrandizing, and lied about stuff, but not in any way that's any different from, the kind of Tony Stark archetype that was kind of born with him. And so weirdly, like, I don't think of him as a villain necessarily any more than kind of like a product of the system, and someone who, was a bit of a shyster, commie, whatever, like most people we revere. But even that, I think when people read the book, they're like, what a fucking asshole. Uh, and you're like, I'm trying to argue against that. I'm saying this is not a big spoiler alert, but he didn't actually kill Louis Le Prince. Um, and still, I think because he's been so lionized, there's been this idea, especially in the United States, that everything we have is because of this one guy. This kind of colossus. Prometheus stole the fire from the gods. He invented everything, which was an image he cultivated.
Right.
That I think the backlash has to be equally strong. And that's the place we're at now. They're just kind of like it's fashionable and popular. It's just like, nah, he was terrible, never invented anything. Fraud.
It's interesting as well that those comparisons with contemporary sort of people on the cutting edge of technology, I guess you would call them. I was about to say scientists, but it's not really. I mean, even with Edison, this inventing lark is, as you say, it's about putting the really brilliant minds together and seeing what happens, rather than
Yeah.
necessarily bringing it up yourself.
Yeah, and it's a nebulous thing about a vision. Like I think Edison had vision, but what does that mean in terms of like office hours and shifts? You can't really pin it down. And the Steve Jobs thing, I like it because it feels really specific to me. Because Steve Jobs, had the turtleneck and the glasses, and he had the image and the jeans, and Edison had his workman's coat and his cigars, and it was equally tailored that this is how I appear when I'm in public. And Steve Jobs had the presentations where he comes out on stage and tells you this is what the future is, and Edison would have his big features in the New York Sun where he did exactly the same thing. And the same way you'll hear Steve Zanacki say like, "Oh, Steve Jobs couldn't code anything." You'll have people who work for Edison being like, he didn't understand the specifics of this stuff. But he kind of had a sense, at least for a long time, of this is what people want, this is what the future looks like, and this is what will sell. In the same way Steve Jobs kind of did. And, like Edison was massively famous. Like he was the most recognizable person in the Western world, and postmen could deliver letters to him with just like his name on it and no address. But even then, you'd read stuff in the press where people are like, is this guy all talk? Does he overprompt? Like the same kind of stuff we'd have now before kind of like, is Elon Musk's thing really just a tunnel in the ground? You'd have all that kind of stuff where he would talk a big game and not follow up. And it really matches up to the way we like to think. And this kind of ties into invention, right? And I really like this idea that stuff comes to pass because it's kind of in the air. And lots of people come at it in their own different ways. And whoever crosses the finish line first is kind of academic. But we write the history of invention and the history of how film was invented. We really focus on the guy who made it, quote unquote. So it has to be this male genius, colossus guy. And Edison was the first one of those kind of figures. And like the way we think of people like him now really is we think of them like that model was for him.
I mean, it's also sort of reveals a certain romanticism in our own way of thinking of these things, of how things are created, how things are invented, how I mean, like I always think of I was thinking when you were talking of like the Wizard of Oz and how the idea of the great Oz, and you find out it's a little guy behind a machine with levers. But when you think about it, although that's the point of the movie, is like be careful of these great, wonderful visionary things, because they're in the reality it's just this little guy at the back with levers. If you think about it, that's actually kind of impressive. I mean, the little guy at the back, he worked out how to do that, and it doesn't, he's got clay feet and all the rest of it, but that makes it more impressive rather than less so. Yeah, he's not a superhuman god. He's a regular guy.
He pulls it off as a little guy. It's interesting you say that because my first book, which was about these filmmakers being kidnapped in North Korea by Kim Jong-il to make propaganda films.
I wanted to talk about that. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. One of the epigraphs, I think for part 3, when they get to North Korea, whatever, is, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Because that was kind of my point about that, was Kim Jong-il was this diminutive guy that no one took seriously in like the North Korean quote unquote royal family. But he pulled off this whole, like he constructed this idea of a country through making films and operas and all this stuff. And the fact that it's just a little guy in platform shoes with a mommy complex, obviously makes it a fraud, but it also, as you say, makes it more impressive because it's like a gigantic magic trick that we're all falling for. And so
Mm.
it's not, because I feel that kind of thing you're saying, it's not underwhelming when you pull the curtain back and see a little guy. It's kind of like, you did this?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the thing with Edison too is like, and this is one thing I wanted to do with this in a sense, is we really like clean, easy answers. We really like that guy made it on that date. And he did it because he's a genius. And it feels like the truth about everything is it's kind of, you're good at some stuff and you're lucky and it's the right time and shit happens. And but I think we this idea of progress is that there are these great minds and great people who come up with stuff. And like the movies play a part in that, right? Like Edison, one of the things he was smart about was once the movies became popular, there was a shit ton of movies about Thomas Edison and about how great he was, and about, there's a Mickey Rooney movie and like all this stuff about, you know, little urchin boy becoming the most intelligent man on earth. Like movies are really good at harnessing that kind of simplified narrative.
Mm.
And he was one of the first people to be like, okay, I can use this to create me for the future.
Mm. Yeah, that's sort of and at the moment, I mean, going back to Louis Le Prince and
Yeah,
that's why perhaps nowadays we're in a stage where we're more we want to go back and revise some of those ideas
yeah,
and again, I mentioned Tesla just because he's David Bowie in The Prestige, and he's Ethan Hawke, I think, in Tesla. Is he Ethan
Tesla,
Hawke
yeah,
plays him? Yeah.
yeah,
And so he's sort of being built up as this this is the real guy over here.
yeah,
But that in itself, that counter narrative, is just as romantically sort of one-eyed as the official version. I mean,
yeah,
isn't the truth everybody's a bit of an asshole? And
yeah.
Edison's a bit of an asshole and brilliant, and if the last 20 years have taught us everything, there are a lot of people in the world who are assholes but also good at what they do.
For sure. And so one of the questions that comes up a lot about this is, hey, so if Louis Le Prince hadn't disappeared, how would the movies be different? And I'm always like, I don't know. He might have been a gigantic prick. He might have been like, I own this. I worked very hard. I almost bankrupted my family. It's mine, period. Or he might have been terrible, but we romanticized him because he disappeared.
Mm.
So we get to project all our stuff onto him, that, here was a guy who was, kind of working in his back shed, the underdog, the kind of Roger Ebert, dirt equals virtue, guy in the big glass building equals villain. That, artisanal, old fashioned, he wasn't in it for the money, but like there's no evidence he wasn't in it for the money. He was investing quite a lot of money into it, expecting a return. And like, the counterpart to that with invention too is obsession, right? Because we love these people who are obsessed with this thing and following this vision. And it is partly because we mostly tell the stories of when that works out.
Mm.
You risk everything and then you win. That's brilliant. Louis the Prince, someone who risked everything, it didn't work out, and it kind of wrecked his entire family.
Mm.
And his obsession, like when you're that obsessed and you're focusing on one thing, it means you're not focusing on anything else, right? So the romantic guy in his shed working on the thing, he's ignoring his wife. He's letting her raise all the kids. He's sucking in all the money. Everybody else has got to work 2 jobs to support him. And, there are moments in Le Prince's story where Lizzie, his wife, was an artist in her own right, gets these great opportunities to go do something, to go be one of the first teachers at Stanford, all this stuff. And Le Prince is that guy who's like, no, 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 no. What I'm doing matters. You stay at home and look after the kid. Which, like, if I had a scene of Thomas Edison doing that, which he did versions of that, you would go, see, fucking asshole, told you.
Mm.
But because he's the underdog, because he disappeared, because he lost, we gloss over stuff that we would hold as kind of irrefutable evidence of assholery. I'm cursing a lot, but that happens.
That's fine. That's fine.
But
That's
irrefutable evidence that guy's a bad guy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, 2 points that raises for me was one was the idea, the Steve Jobs idea that his death kind of seals his reputation as, and
Yeah,
you have, he gets to be played by Michael Fassbender, and
yeah,
Zuckerberg gets to be played by Jesse Eisenberg, one of the more dislikable actors in
yeah.
Hollywood. Um, and the other thing I wanted the other point that I really want to emphasize how Lizzie is kind of, if anything, she's the hero of the story. She's the
Yeah.
person who is sort of battling to keep his name alive, keep his patents, trying to wrest control of the patents, trying to find him and find out what happened to him. And as you say, at great personal sacrifice to her own career. Sorry, that's the village bells are going. Just
That's
for our
lovely.
I'm keeping this in for local colour. Just for our listeners, I'll just tell you, I'm talking to Paul. Paul, you're in Canada at the moment, right?
In Edmonton, Alberta.
Right. Well, that's quite close to. Is that where near where Terrence Malick did Days of Heaven?
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
uh, the assassination of Jesse James was shot kind of in the prairies right around here.
Right. Yeah. And Andrew Dominic is a big Malick fan, and
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. So that wouldn't surprise me. So just to give some context to our listeners, it's just now 8 o'clock in the morning. Hence the bells telling us all to go to church, because this is a Catholic Italian country. And Paul, your time is what, about midnight now, or?
It'll be midnight now. Yeah.
Oh my God! So what? Midnight in Alberta and 8 o'clock in northern Italy. So that's the
Yeah.
context of bells ringing, and it's also probably why Paul's been such a sweary Mary, because he's because it's like late and I'm.
Honestly, awkward. My 7-year-old will tell you I'm like this at 7 in the morning, and it's a
All right.
problem. Yeah.
Oh, do you find it difficult not to swear in front of your children? Because when I was bringing up my kids and they were little, we just like went, not swearing is just not going to be an option.
No, and it's also like my mom hates this, but I kind of have this thing of like she will know when it's appropriate. Do you know what I mean? Like she knows not to have a poo in the classroom. She can figure out not to say the F word in the classroom, and so it's not rampant. But occasionally, if she catches a flying F word, it's not the end of the world. That's how we feel about it, and we'll
Yeah.
see if that pays off in 20 years.
I mean, it's partly defined by the fact that we're living in a country in which no one was understanding English. I mean, not no one, but people in our village don't understand it, and culturally here, especially old men or older men, they use swearing like punctuation, and there's no sense of granddad, the children. Nobody ever says that. It's like, yeah, granddad can say whatever he wants. Whatever he
Yeah.
fucking wants.
There you go.
Sorry, that was a little bit of digression, just caused by the bells of the village. But yeah, that's interesting that you've got similar parenting philosophy as I, and my
Yeah.
kids are now grown and they're perfectly fine. So whatever I did or didn't do seems
They
to
can
work.
tell. You got to give them credit.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were talking about Lizzie as the sort of
Yeah.
heroine of the film that is no doubt going to be optioned from this book. This would be the plum role, I would imagine.
Yeah, and the book has been optioned.
Hey,
Um, yeah, thank you, by a producer in France. And it's like you'll know this. I do screenwriting stuff at the time. The great thing is I'm always like, this is never happening, but it's a nice paycheck every 12 months to like help with the gas bill or something. But the thing I had writing the book, because you're right, it kind of feels like a movie, but at the same time, there's something very uncinematic about a guy at a bench trying to invent a thing. That's not dramatic. That's boring. And I used to think like I played a score from The Prestige while I was writing, and I'd be like, this is kind of how I imagine, whoever shot that film is shooting this in my head. And so the vibe and the hook feels like a movie, but the actual action and then he spent 7 years tinkering with lenses is not that dramatic. But if you then go, oh, it's about this woman trying to figure out what happened, kind of going back. There's this fascinating thing where Le Prince, he was in New York with his family and working on a film camera, and he had this growing paranoia, and he decided New York is a bad place to be. And Lizzie became convinced that was because of Edison, because Edison had a reputation as a thief, and they shared patent lawyers and that kind of thing. And so Le Prince finished working in Leeds, where his father-in-law was, and we had more resources, and he felt he could work in private. But he left the family in New York. And he only, his eldest son was with him for a while. And so there is a cinematic idea we talk about where if you have Lizzie as your main character coming to Leeds to figure out what's happened to a husband that she really hasn't seen in 3 or 4 years, he's been working on this thing. Then you've got this idea of her trying to figure out what happened to him, whether the invention worked, and if she still knows this guy while he's gone, which is kind of like a ghost story, which is cool.
A return of Martin Blair sort of idea.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know, it's weird stuff with because I thought when I started writing the book, there's a book by Brian Burns called Public Enemies, which the Michael Mann book is nominally based on. And the idea of Public Enemies is it's a year in the life of America's Most Wanted. And so it's not a biography of one of them, but it's Bonnie and Clyde, and it's Little Boy, Pretty Boy Floyd, and it's Dillinger, and it's kind of a collective biography. And my first thought making this, when I pitched it to my agent, was this will be like a filmy Public Enemies. It'll have Le Prince, but it'll also have Leroy and Edison and Lumiere and Booley and all these guys, all the way up to Méliès. And the idea is, over 25 years, it starts with all these people, but it ends up with Le Prince, who's the linchpin, let's say, but it's an ensemble. It ends with him disappearing. It ends with Méliès and the Gamme Montparnasse selling toys, and everybody's forgotten him. And it ends with Charles-Émile Reynaud, who made the first animated film, throwing all his stuff into the Seine and trying to kill himself. And the idea is these two parties, the Lumiere brothers and Edison, are left standing, and everybody else is kind of, met a tragic fate. And she was like, that sounds like a blob. You're never going to find a structure to this. And I was like, I absolutely am going to find a structure to this. And I came back 6 months later going, that's a blob. There's no structure to this. And so I was like, okay, I've got to focus on Le Prince, but I guess I'll need name recognition. So Edison's got to be a big part of this. And then she and my editor were kind of like, you've got to trust people are going to care about Le Prince and his family, even if they don't know who they are. And so my assumption at that point was, okay, Louis is going to be the main character, obviously. But as you write, you find this thing where, as I wrote, I would go, he might be the main character, but Lizzie's the best part. Lizzie's the kind of heart of it. Because Lizzie, she was like a young woman from Yorkshire who's no one in her family's ever had a formal education. And then her father, who'd grown up in tenements, 8 brothers and sisters, bunch of them die young. He does really well with a couple of patents for a couple of boiler valves, this and that. And in the way you could in the Industrial Revolution, he becomes pretty wealthy. And so he's able to send Lizzie and her brother away to study. And so she starts in Paris, and she's working in the same workshop as Rodin, and she's got these big dreams, and she parked everything to support her husband going, I'm going to make pictures move, with no training, no funding, no nothing. And which is a pretty heroic thing to do, especially when, like her, you think of yourself as a modern, emancipated, kind of equal partner woman. To go, well, no, actually, I love this guy and I believe in this, so I'm going to do the thing that's kind of anathema to what I expected for myself. And she pops out the babies, raises all these kids. She works as a teacher. She sends him all the paychecks. She supports everything, never doubts that it's going to work out. And it doesn't work out. And she's not only left to pick up the pieces, but in a really tragic way becomes convinced that she's in direct opposition to the most famous guy in the world, who's Thomas Edison. And so it's got this kind of tragic, it's got this weird kind of like self-sacrifice turned detective turned tragedy.
Yeah, sort of slightly delusional.
Yeah, like by the end, like she was fully convinced that she held these kind of opposing ideas of Thomas Edison had my husband killed, but also don't want to admit he's been killed. So I'm kind of sort of weaving these tales that he's still alive somewhere in a basement. It's 30 years later when her mind was kind of going. and to a great degree, I found while writing, she sacrificed more than he did, because at least Le Prince got to chase the dream.
Mm. Mm.
She got to just do support and kind of, take a gamble and then lose everything.
Mm.
And so she's brilliant. And again, the first book was kind of the same, where I thought, oh, the filmmaker guy will be the main guy. And it wasn't. It was his wife was equally famous and all this stuff. But yeah, it's that thing of like, I can't remember who I was listening to the other day. Maybe it was Clooney on WTF or something, talking about the difference between like the biggest part and the best part in a movie. You know what I mean? And telling someone, maybe it was Affleck, maybe it was about that Boston Bar movie, this idea of like, you take the best role in the movie, not the biggest role in the movie. And Lizzie feels like the best role in the movie.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because it also serves as a corrective, and I want you to write this into your contract when they do sign the big film deal, of not, because this drives me absolutely spare, that there's always a wife next to, or a romantic partner next to, an obsessional genius who has a scene at some point where they say, okay, go and do your thing, but when you've done it, come back to us, and it's this, and he's basically kind of like the shrew nag, or the, all of those negative misogynistic stereotypes of basically women are pulling you back to domesticity, and the you have to go and that's one of the ties you have to cut in order to achieve greatness. And it's just like, I've seen that as recently as Ford versus Ferrari. It's just, God damn it, can't we think of a new, can't we just do this differently? It's just so stereotypical, so boring.
And at best, it's like, unfair. God bless her.
Yeah,
it really is.
Yeah, it's really unfair.
And it's the thing I always think about with invention and with making movies, on a thing I'm writing up now. We kind of never think of it in terms of an ecosystem. We like to go, well, he was a genius and he was driven and he would never give up. And there's no way you can do that without an ecosystem around you. And Le Prince, Lizzie was the main part of that. She's the air that keeps the whole thing going. But there was also people he worked with who were instrumental to what he does. And that goes back to the Edison thing, where Edison, because he was a brand, he needed everybody who worked for him to be basically work for hire. You know what I mean? You draw something for Disney, it belongs to Disney. You did something for Edison, it belonged to Edison. Whereas Le Prince was a great example of none of it happens if you don't have a wife whose self-sacrifice was the opposite of that dramatic thing, but it was just like, that sounds fucking brilliant. That sounds like you could do it. I'll try my best to help. No negative, no, at best, God bless her, she's reluctantly doing it. And he had 4 guys in the workshop with him who were solving stuff, day to day. Like, none of these cases, the Lumiere brothers, none of them, the second you scratch the surface, you're like, oh wow, there's 25 other people who were instrumental to this.
Well, let's go back to the Wizard of Oz. You pull back the curtain, there's a little guy pulling the levers, but behind the little guy, there are other little guys helping him fix the levers to something to make it all work.
Yeah, and I think it's because I guess there's always one, two, whatever, limited number of people who have the vision, and we love the vision. It's not so sexy to be like, oh yeah, and I believe in the vision. But and I like that because that story, it doesn't have any of those tropes, right? It doesn't have the wife who's like, as soon as you're done, I'm putting up with this, but kind of thing. And it doesn't have anybody fighting over credit. Like, none of the people Le Prince worked with came out later going, well, actually, I was, they were all like, no, we did it together and he was a genius and we loved following his lead. And it kind of weirdly doesn't have any of the cliches. Except, and then he disappeared. Bum, bum, bum. That's the only one, kind of. And otherwise, it's kind of in a weird, not a lovely story, but it's kind of very, very human. That, this guy had an idea and he was living in a time where you could make bank off an idea and it seemed accessible, right? It doesn't seem accessible now that I'm just going to go back there and invent an iPad. It doesn't seem accessible that I'm going to make a $1 billion movie. But back then it was a thing, like, I have an idea. this could change everything for generations. And then it just kind of played out in a kind of human, hopeful, and the hopefulness is important because one of the reasons I kind of connected with the Prince as I wrote is Edison never got movies. Like, he was kind of late to it, kind of hoping it would make money, but he was like, it's a toy. I can't see why anybody likes it. Like, even years later, he'd be like, I still don't get why people like this thing.
It's so funny that you say about him having vision, and that's one of these things, and yet he's it's completely blind to the commercial possibilities of the motion pictures. Like, I guess some, it's like the Hudsucker proxy, for kids, when he gets the hula hoop,
Yeah, and that's the thing about vision is it's not like like you're gonna miss out. Sometimes your vision, as it was for Edison, was concrete furniture and cars made out of gold. Like, because your vision, sometimes it hits and sometimes it doesn't. And with this, he didn't get it. And the Lumiere brothers were like, this will be sexy for a year or two, and then something else will come. Whereas Le Prince has these notebooks where, like, he sketched out cinemas, and he's like, this is going to change politics, and this is going to change. No one's going to send their kid to war once they've seen what war actually looks like. That's going to end, and you'll be able to teach, deaf and mute kids to, like, communicate without needing all of this, and you'll be able to, like, put this in school. And there was no one else really on the record who had that vision. And as someone who loves movies for all those kind of idealistic, quaint ideas, it was really cool to go, oh, the guy who made the first one, or the oldest surviving one, wasn't just trying to invent a product like the other guys. He actually believed in it. Which kind of had never computed into my sense of the invention of the movies. It's like these guys invented a machine.
And maybe that idea of the effect of cinema, let's say, as an art form, politically and what have you. Maybe that's also, to flip that, those are really positive ideas of, people are going to become pacifist, people are going to be more democratically engaged, people are going to be educated and what have you. But also, it is going to sort of, not brainwash is maybe too dumb a term, but it is also going to frame our narratives in a way which are not necessarily coincident with truth and not necessarily coincident with the best things in humanity. So, for instance, drama, we were talking earlier, why do we have this idea of just the visionary and not the ecological sort of background to it? Well, that's kind of a little bit because drama is inherently, well, I don't want to, fascistic is going too far, but we'd rather put everything in one character and have them lead the drama than say, well, it was complicated because Ralph went Monday to Tuesday, and then Jenny took over Wednesday and to Friday, and it was this cinema isn't good at collective endeavor. It's good at one person doing it all.
It is, yeah. I'm friendly with this guy called Tristan Gallagher, who's a producer at a company called The Bureau. He produced Andrew Haig's Weekend and all his other films and that kind of stuff. When we had coffee like years ago, and we were talking about stuff, and he was saying the stuff he was looking at then, he was like, I really want to find a way. He was like, I'm bored of all, like, in the way he was saying about the reaction to outdated ideas. They're weirdly a mirror image of outdated ideas. And he was saying specifically, I want to find ways to tell movies that are about collective progress and action. And he had this great kind of insight of, like, the stuff we're trying to deal with now, whether it's capitalism going off the rails or climate change or whatever, it was all stuff that needs collective response. But our media, particularly movies, is so designed to be about the protagonist that it's not, I don't want to say harmful because that feels oversimplified, but it's not helpful.
Oh, it's definitely harmful.
It's harmful. And it really is, like, baked in. Like, I went to film school, every screenwriting book, cut out the unnecessary character. Can you combine them? Can you make them one guy? It's designed to be that way. But Le Prince, in a very Victorian, white, middle class kind of way, to them progress was going to be good, period. Anything new, it moves us forwards. They almost had no conception that something could backfire. Which is, like, I have this thing, I was talking to my wife earlier, like, I'm terrified of deep fakes and that stuff. I kind of can't, I have this really idealistic idea of what the moving image can do to us. but I'm also terrified of what it is now. I don't know that I could handle it if I was 15 years old or something. And the kind of fatalist in me, and this feeds in something I'm writing now. I think everything good gets co-opted and just fucked to its exact opposite. And the movies are kind of that in a way. But that was refreshing to be writing about a guy who made the first and who only saw the positives. Only saw this is going to be amazing. And he'd been in the war and he'd been in the siege of Paris. And it came from a really human place of like, well, no one's going to have to go through that again. If I can show mothers, they're going to be like, no, my son's not going.
Yeah, everybody's going to watch Battleship Potemkin and going to go, right, no,
we're done. Yeah. And, he didn't. But again, what's interesting too is you can also see that as ego, right? You can also see him as going, I'm designing this machine that will fix everything.
Yeah, the new Machiavelli, the sort of H.G. Wells science technocrat I'll solve the world.
Yeah. And so maybe part of it is part of the times and that positivity about, well, we've got trains and phones and everything's great. And part of it may also be a guy going, I'm going to fix everything, in a kind of lunatic way, which he may have been. 'Cause that's another thing about writing about something that happened 130 years ago. Anytime you're trying to figure out who they were as people, unless you're quoting someone directly, you're making an assumption. I think about that, with any friends I have or you have. For every 5 people I can find who say they're amazing, I'll find 5 people who say they're the worst people who's ever lived. So I could find 5 people who worked with Louis Le Prince saying he was a genius, he was lovely, whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean he was. So for better or for worse, he saw the good things no one else saw and didn't foresee any of the potential bad.
Yeah.
But there's also and I know I'm rambling, but there is this kind of unpacking of, and I was trying to do this writing the book, what would it be like to think of movies if you'd never seen one or conceived of one? Because it's kind of well documented with photography, how that completely changed people's ways of thinking of themselves. It became much more about your kind of physical embodiment of yourself and of thinking of death and family. And film kind of did that same thing, and people became obsessed with seances and ghost films and what it meant to be mortal. But I was trying to put myself in the mindset of he's not inventing the movies as I know them. He's inventing a thing. What was that thing to him? I've got to unpack 100 years of thinking it's obvious what it is. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's that idea of, I mean, we've lived through these technological things, me and you. We've had. I remember going to the chemists with my little film of 26 photographs and handing it in, and then going back 4 or 5 days later and picking it up and going through and there being this distance between taking a photograph and seeing what actually turned out. Nowadays, obviously, nobody has that. I don't have that. Everybody is just taking instant snaps and looking at them instantly, and the same's true of video, the same's true of TikTok. That's all changed really recently.
And it impacts your sense of presence. Sorry, but because that's one thing they had. They were convinced that motion is life. If something moves, it's alive. And they were just kind of coming to terms with, we're making these machines do things. That can't be life because But there's this conviction that if you get people's images, their physical forms, even if they're black and white and flat or whatever, and you make them move, that to all intents and purposes, that's presence, that's life, which obviously isn't true. But that thing now of us trying to separate, this is kind of a tangent, but I'm always fascinated by it. My daughter's 7, her and all her friends, they're camera ready. Do you know what I mean? They know how to speak the camera. They've seen it enough on YouTube. They've got camera voices. And that's also about presence. That's also about what means you're here now. Is the thing on the screen here now? I spend more time with stuff on my screen than my wife. Is that more here now than she is? Kind of thing. And they were at the kind of very naive gateway into that. Of well, if your grandmother's dead, but I can make her move and talk, then she's basically here. And again, seeing just the positive of that.
It goes down to the etymology even. Animation is,
Yeah,
anima is the soul. So you're
yeah,
putting the soul into stuff that's by making it move.
yeah. Which is where I don't know if you've seen that creepy idea now that they think, I don't know if it's in the future or whatever, that your Alexa can speak in your, you know, dead lost relative's voice to make them present.
Mm.
So, you can go, grandma, add loo roll to my shopping list, and your dead grandma says she's doing it or whatever, which is creepy as hell. But it's not
Yeah.
that different, I guess, from a moving picture of someone who's died. Like I remember as a kid being really not unsettled, but it was an uncanniness built into movies of Humphrey Bogart's been dead forever, but I have a
Yes.
relationship with him
Yes.
because of stuff. I know what he sounds like. I know how he moves. I've watched him over and over again. I know the twitches of his face. And he's been dead for ages before I was born. That's
Mm.
weird.
Mm.
And that I love that. I love it's interesting to me that Le Prince disappeared in a sense, because the whole point of the movies to them was to keep stuff present.
Mm.
And then he goes non-present.
Mm.
And the fundamental kind of uncanny weirdness of movies is that it, unless something's been made in the last 5, you're continually kind of communing with, you're having a seance, really. You're watching
Mm.
dead people do something um, in
I
a way
re-
that's believable, even though it's not embodied in the same way a spectral thing would be believable,
I
even though
remember
it's not.
having this factoid. I don't know where I've got it from, but I haven't sourced it, put it that way. But I think it's fascinating that the original laughter tracks that they used for right up until Friends and up until modern day sitcoms were all sourced from the 50s and were basically laughter tracks that they weren't using, they weren't
The live
re-recording
stuff.
people laughing. They weren't re-recorded. They were just putting it on from these, punching it up here and there with this. So basically, by the time you get to the 90s and the 2000s, the laughter that you're hearing on your favorite sitcoms is frequently dead people laughing.
Like, that's disturbing. That's a hellscape.
Isn't
That's
it?
crazy.
Isn't it?
Like that's gonna ruin it for me. The next time I'm on Netflix and I go, I can't pick any of the shit, so I'll watch the familiar shit. I'm now
Yeah.
gonna be like, that's
You're
people who were
watching.
dead when this happened, laughing at something else.
Yeah, yeah. A Big Bang Theory, they're actually the studio audience is actually just dead because that's just such an
But
unfunny program that I can't
you're
believe it.
lucky if you survive it at home.
Exactly. I mean that's such a that's what I loved about the book is it made me think so much about cinema in general. It is this murder mystery. It is this, you mentioned the Da Vinci Code earlier on, and obviously this
Yeah.
is a non-fiction book, so it's a lot different, but it does have that same sort of drive.
Yeah.
I remember when everybody was reading the Da Vinci Code. We all got very sniffy afterwards and like, oh no, it's rubbish, obviously. But
I like to convince myself that as I was reading it, I was like, this is terrible, but I'm not sure that's what happened.
yeah, I raced through it in like 2 days on the beach, so I'm pretty sure I really liked it. I'm pretty positive I really liked it. For a critic, I'm really uncritical when it comes to enjoying stuff. I just like enjoy it, and then afterwards
Yeah.
think I loved it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was any good. It just means I
Yeah.
loved it. Speaking of loving things, what would be your recommended film book for us? What book have you loved to do with the world of cinema, to do with the history of film, to do whichever you prefer?
This is a weird thing, right? Because I read a bunch, and I was thinking about this. I was like, John's gonna ask me this, and everybody I'm gonna recommend has been on the podcast recently, so that doesn't work. I'm reading Charles Elton's Semina book, which is really good.
Mm.
Um, and I was thinking about that earlier, and I was like, you know what? Because I really love movies, but I've realized I don't really get drawn to writing about movies,
Mm.
because there are people, including yourself, plenty of people who can write about movies better than I can. And I was like, oh, I like writing about people who make movies rather
Mm.
than movies. And so I was trying to think, if I was recommending books about people who make movies, what would it be? And a double feature I came up with was John Gregory Dunn's The Studio,
Mm.
and Spike Lee's Gotta Have It, which is his. So the Studio is John Gregory Dunn getting full access in 1968, 69 as the studio system's basically dead. to 20th Century Fox and writing a really funny kind of acerbic um, book about how that all goes. And then Spike Lee's Got to Have It, 87, 89. And it's essentially Spike Lee's diaries and process of making She's Gotta Have It as a guerrilla independent film. And I remember being in film school and reading Spike Lee's Gotta Have It and going, this is amazing. This feels like I'm with him in the car. You know, all the minutiae of I feel shit today. This worked out. I lost some weight. I hate that guy. I came up with this idea here. You know, those would be mine. And then this isn't, you'll probably know about this, and it's not a book, but it counts. There's a PDF of the first story session for Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is Spielberg, Lawrence Kasdan, and George Lucas, which is, you know, I don't know, 60 pages, 80 pages transcript of them just talking through it. And it's online. You can find it fairly easily. And it's three really great filmmakers, I think, coming up with the worst possible ideas for anything for the longest time.
He should wear a top hat. He should wear a top hat and carry a cane.
Terrible ideas. You know, he's a playboy. He's an alcoholic. He was dating Marion when she was 13 years old. You go, that's not good.
Oh, but by the end of it, that stayed in, unfortunately.
Exactly. Well, you do
I was a child. You were old enough. Oh no.
Exactly.
Oh no.
But the great thing about that PDF is the ideas are terrible, and slowly they just get to the good ones. And I love that one in terms of making films, because it's like, okay, Steven Spielberg has a bunch of shit ideas at some point. And so that's my double and a half feature of books about people making films. John Gregory owns the studio. Spike Lee's Got to Have It, and that PDF, if you can dig it up.
Yeah, I definitely will. I've not heard of that. So I'm really looking forward to. I'm going to do that today. I remember
it's great.
I remember talking to Tom Schoen about Spielberg, and one of the things he said which stuck with me was Spielberg has a lot of ideas, and they're not always good ones. You know, it's just like he's just loads and loads and loads of ideas, and then his films are as good as the filters around him, really.
Yeah, I remember reading the Judge McBride biography of him, and there's a bit in it about how so Spielberg had this long contract at Universal, and because he'd locked himself in that long contract, everybody else, Coppola, Lucas, Milius, they're all off making great movies, and he's making television, and he can't get out of it. And you know, Mike Medavoy, his agent's like, you got to break this contract, and Spielberg's got a daddy thing with Sid Sheinberg, so I can't, he believed in me. And so one of the scripts he was really dead set on making as a feature to break out of television was like an updated Flower Power in 1968 Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but the dwarves were Chinese guys working in San Francisco at Chinese Laundry, and it's terrible. It sounds racist and sexist and awful, but there's like 5 pages where it's like he spent a year trying to make this, and you just go, thank fuck he didn't.
That
would have been terrible.
I talked to Mike Medavoy this week, and he told me about ditching him as a thing. And it's sort of funny that you sort of think you ditched Spielberg, but when you hear about this sort of stuff, it's like, well, you know, it wasn't necessarily obvious Spielberg would be Spielberg.
It wasn't, and I spoke to Medavoy like 3 weeks ago for this next thing I'm writing, and the thing that's really interesting is, I don't know how you felt about Medavoy. I get the sense he was cocky as hell back then. But he was saying this thing where he was like, I really just thought he'd be ripping people off. I thought, you know, Francis and George and Philip Kaufman, for some reason, he was like, those were the really intelligent, well-read, creative guys. And I thought Steven Spielberg was going to make B movies. And you know, and I was like, you got to break this contract. And he was like, I can't. I walked out on him, and that was that. Which is interesting, because I don't know why I got onto this, but you also get people back then like Milius and stuff, where it's like, oh no, he's the only guy who like somehow instinctively knew what people wanted, which again is back to that vision, one guy, weird male genius thing.
Did you see the documentary about Milius?
I did.
I might just be called Milius, actually. I don't know. I have a problem with Milius just because he's such a right-wing blowhard, and there are so many. You know, I remember Red Dawn coming out when it came out, and it was just like, God Almighty, this is. We seem to have lost that. I mean, I lived through the '80s. I remember there being a real a sort of opposition to the idea of Top Gun and things like that. There was a real sort of like, this stuff's just war Reaganite propaganda, you know. And nowadays it seems to be, yeah, more of that, please, you know, without anybody.
It's back to that shit, that everything that was good becoming shit and everything that was shit becoming good kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's a weird, I think it's in the documentary at the end where they're like, one of the operations in Iraq or something was called Operation Red Dawn. There's just that thing where like, it's an interesting thing I feel now where I think and this is relevant to movies, where I think we're so used to everything being like, are you for it? Are you against it? But it's in a very shallow kind of like, are you a stan or are you a hater kind of tribal way? And I don't necessarily know that it's principled anymore, where you're like, that crosses a line and that feels unhealthy for us. It's more just like, are you a stan? Are you a hater? Are you one of them? Are you one of us? Are you hashtag this, hashtag that? Where, you know, I was a bit too late for Red Dawn, but I remember stuff like that. We'd go, oh, this seems iffy. And now it just, you know, nothing. You know, I have this about Marvel films, but like I can enjoy watching Marvel films, but I can also be weirdly uncomfortable with the fact that I'm, you know, basically taking my kid to Pentagon-funded propaganda stuff about big, muscly Aryan men in battle gear. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. I was watching Stranger Things, the latest thing, and I was just like, the way guns from the very first season are put into the hands of children is just freaking weird. And the thing that's even weirder is nobody seems to think it's weird. Everybody seems to just, I've not heard anyone go, you know, children learning to shoot things, that's the solution. I think The Quiet Place Part 2 as well has that as a serious storyline, is don't worry, the kids learn to shoot a gun, so that saves the day. And it's like, it's
weird, right? Because the flip side of that feels like anything, like I'll read books, watch a movie where a character does something morally ambiguous or reprehensible. And that's meant to be what these stories are about. You know what I mean? You don't go like this whole thing, and I guess Marvel's first aid with it, but this idea that there are people out there who watch Goodfellas and go, well, he was clearly making gangsters sexy. Like our understanding, our like literate reading of narratives has flattened out in a weird way.
Yeah.
Where the kids shooting a gun were like fucking awesome. And then something ambiguous and unpleasant being in a film, we go, well, that must mean the person who made it is a horrible person because he's showing me something uncomfortable. And so being able to digest the stuff we're meant to digest about everybody being an asshole, as you were saying earlier, and not being okay with the idea that guns are just everywhere. There's this weird topsy-turviness, which is when I go, shit, do I sound like I'm 65? Because I'm not, like I haven't seen Stranger Things, and part of it is I'm not a nostalgist, because that makes me really uncomfortable, the kind of like, things used to be better, or so I'm making a Spielberg rip-off thing. I'm never interested. I'm like, that feels weird. But there are times where I catch myself going, have we lost our minds? And I sound like my dad. And then I go, oh.
But your dad was cool, you know?
Exactly. Well, see, my dad was like, the reason I got into movies was he had a wall of VHS tapes.
Right.
And I would just like pick anything that looked cool. Like I remember when I was 4 or 5 watching Raiders of the Lost Ark, just because it was a rainy day, and I was like, that dude looks good. He's bare chested. He's got a whip. This looks awesome. You know, I remember putting on Batman Returns, and you know, like everybody having your life changed by Michelle Pfeiffer, and having no idea, I didn't know who Batman was, had read comics, just being like, that looks sick, because he had everything on the wall, like everything. So he was pretty cool.
That's amazing. That's great. Well, listen, Paul, thank you so much for being my guest. Thank you so much for the book. The book is called The Man Who Invented Motion Pictures, A True Tale of Obsession, Murder and Movies. Okay, and that's available wherever you get good books. Thanks so much, Paul.
Yeah, thanks for putting up with me talking in circles.
Great. So that was my conversation with Paul. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we obviously did. I think we had a really good time. And as you can tell, I enjoyed his book. And I think you should too if you have the opportunity to read it. So my thanks go to Paul for being my guest, Elliot Atkins for the music, Ali Harwood for the art, and you, listener, without which all of this would be a vacuous, vapid, vain endeavour without ever any true, deep, profound, significant effect in the universe. So thank you very much, and we'll talk next week. Take care.